The issue of judicial activism is reaching a fevered pitch here in the United States. Claims of judges attempting to pull off a coup against a duly elected president of the United States is growing ever louder. But don't worry, my friends, Chief Justice Roberts of the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't like this kind of rhetoric, and he likes it even less coming from the president himself, so he decided to do something about it. He put out a public statement. He said, "For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose." Of course, Trump didn't take that lying down, and here was his reply on Fox News.
Because we're gonna first hit the other big news of the day, which was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court issued what a rare statement about your suggestion on Truth that you posted earlier today that Judge James Boasberg should be impeached after he ordered those deportation flights to El Salvador halted, essentially turned around. The Chief Justice said it was more than two centuries. We understood that essentially impeachment was for very rare circumstances and not an appropriate response to rulings you disagree with. What's your reaction to the court's stepping in to make a statement here? They didn't make a statement when Joe Biden, decided to forgive all those student loans.
Well, he didn't mention my name in the statement. I just saw it quickly. He didn't mention my name, yeah. But many people have called for his impeachment, the impeachment of this judge. I don't know who the judge is, but he's radical left. He was Obama appointed.
Now, the media was naturally ecstatic that Justice Roberts got involved. CNN couldn't help but crow about it. This is an article by Joan Biskupic, or whatever. She writes, "John Roberts has enabled Trump. Now he hopes to restrain him." Let's see. Once again, it comes down to John Roberts and Donald Trump. Oh dear. It was Chief Justice Roberts, of course, who wrote last year's Supreme Court decision giving then-candidate Trump substantial immunity from criminal prosecution. How dare he? But in recent weeks, it was also Roberts who steered the court in its calibrated approach to litigation arising from President Trump's overhauling government, refusing to give administration lawyers the quick endorsement that they sought. Since 2017, when Trump began his first presidential term, Roberts has been both an enabler and a restraint on Trump's agenda. After weeks of silence to Trump's rants against the judiciary, Roberts was likely provoked on Tuesday by a heated post referring to a federal judge currently handling a migrant deportation case, boy, that is a nice way to put it, as crooked. Trump declared the judge should be impeached. Soon after, Roberts issued a statement, which we already covered. For retired Justice Stephen Breyer, the statement met the moment. "It's informative," he said. "It is short. It doesn't blame anyone or praise anyone. It says, if you don't like what the judges holds, appeal." Now, as the top leader of the judicial and executive branches, Roberts and Trump have now had 2 dramatic clashes. Roberts' Tuesday statement called a similar rebuke of Trump in 2018. She writes, "After a San Francisco-based U.S. District Court judge issued a preliminary decision against Trump's first-term asylum policy, the president denounced him as an Obama judge and added to reporters, 'I'll tell you what, it's not going to happen like this anymore.' And Justice Roberts countered with a statement that began, 'We do not have Obama judges or Trump judges, Bush judges or Clinton judges.' He said all judges were doing their level best to do equal right to those appearing before him, which, my friends, is insane and laughable. But of course, the Justice Roberts most likely felt compelled to say this because you got to defend your own. You got to defend your branch. But it's still a stupid statement. Of course, there are radical judges. There are plenty of them. Which takes me to my next point. Despite the excited CNN staff, the reality is Chief Justice Roberts involving himself here is completely tone deaf. There have been a rash of judicial rulings against the administration and what is starting to feel and appear like an endless stream of attacks against the president from the bench. For example, in the last 48 hours, these are just a handful of headlines about judges stepping in. You've got the federal judge who blocked Trump's ban on transgender people serving in the military. You had judge who said that USAID workers have to be reinstated after they were cut. You have a judge who says rehired probationary workers can't be placed on administrative leave. You had a judge who temporarily barred the EPA from clawing back $14 billion in green bank grants. And these were all stories within just the last 48 hours. The Democrats, my friends, have become powerless. They are shattered. They are torn, infighting, tearing each other apart. The left-wing media is also in retreat, with mass firings of the radical leftist journalists happening at regular intervals. The only remaining organized, coordinated effort left in the leftist playbooks is the courts themselves. And they are putting themselves directly in the spotlight to fight back against Trump. Now, when you put all of these rulings together, collectively, it makes it appear that the judiciary is trying to flex its muscles to curb, at best, what it sees as executive overreach, or at worst, it is an attempt by the bench, by the courts, to thwart a political opponent. And if that's the case, then it is these judges who are imposing their political ideology into their rulings rather than deferring to the Constitution itself. For example, the Alien Enemies Act case with this Judge Boasberg, the one that Trump is calling for the impeachment of, surrounds his order to halt deportations. This judge has no power to second-guess the executive branch over national security prerogatives. It is not within his jurisdiction to tell Trump when and where and how he can use the power of the Alien Enemies Act. The only option that this judge actually had was to argue over the validity of the invoking of the Alien Enemies Act, not how it's enforced. And yet his actions were clear. He was telling the Trump administration how he could enforce the Alien Enemies Act. And this is a big problem for the courts. You see, unlike in previous decades where their rulings didn't necessarily receive a national spotlight all the time, most of the time in fact, in this particular instance, they are the only ones who are in any way successfully impeding to a degree the Trump agenda. And because of this, they are being scrutinized in a way that the courts have never been in our lifetimes. It doesn't help that the left is rallying behind the courts as their last bastion of resistance against Trump. It is a dangerous move to use the courts this way. On one hand, these rulings by mostly Obama or Biden-era appointees demonstrates the judiciary's power to slow Trump's agenda when Congress and the Democrat Party are weakened. But this comes at a huge cost, and that is the judiciary's neutrality. It is the bedrock of the court systems. And when you have rulings that are consistently aligning with a political ideology rather than the Constitution as a way to thwart a duly elected president, you have a public problem. They are eroding the trust that the people of the United States have in the court system itself. And long term, this scrutiny will damage the courts more than the Trump administration ever could. The judicial system lacks an army of their own. They have no way to enforce their rulings. They rely on public legitimacy and the executive branch to enforce their rulings. And history already has its warnings here in the United States for the courts. Think back to 1832 Worcester versus Georgia case, where President Andrew Jackson just said to hell with the Supreme Court and ignored them. There is nothing the courts can do to stop the executive branch if the public is not behind them. So leftist judges may win short-term battles, but the visibility here, them being in the spotlight for the American people, risks their long-term legitimacy. The black-robed men and women of the courts are under the microscope now, and whether or not the court system can survive all of this unscathed, I think will largely depend on what happens in the coming months as the rulings head up to the Supreme Court. Of course, only time will tell.